Hi, I'm Ming Evans, a WQ student now, also a student interviewer in the WQLEAP hiring committee. I plan to interview my boss on the committee, also one of the faculty interviewers, Dr. Craig Blacklock. Let's go.
Great. Great. As your student worker, I want to ask in total 5 questions for the committee. Um, the first question is, can you concisely introduce the history of student hiring interviewer, the position?
Um, I'm not exactly sure when it was introduced, but it was definitely maybe 4 years ago. Uh, but I don't remember exactly why it was introduced. It seemed to be at the point when they were looking for student input on hiring, and I think it was introduced by Jennifer Marquardt. I don't know how that worked internally, but it seemed like a good idea to have students involved in the hiring process. Bearing in mind that we're at that point we were hiring for the English program, so the idea was also to have English majors giving feedback on the candidates.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is, do you find any magic points during interview, or anything you think is challenging or difficult for you to chair the hiring committee now?
Well, that's sort of two different questions. One's then about the concept of the interview. Sometimes when you're interviewing, you can tell early on that the candidate is very good, simply because of what they're saying, and usually that makes it much easier to go through the rest of the questions. With some interviews, very early on you realise that they're not really a good candidate, that they're not answering the questions in the correct way. And although that's rarer, usually because we've screened people beforehand, we've looked at their CV and we've made a decision to interview them. Usually they're pretty good, but sometimes there's something happens, whether it's a magic moment or not, but there is a moment when you realise that a candidate is probably good or probably bad, and we've sort of norming across a set of ideas that I've been doing this now for 5 years, so you kind of get a feel for what the answers should be. The challenging concept of chairing the committee. In general, there are sort of normal challenges because it's a management job, so you've got to manage other people. Student representatives are fairly easy to manage, but it's a volunteer system as well, so although I'm managing a team, they're also volunteering, so there's only a certain amount of pressure that can be added. So it's just an expectation that people will do their job, but that's why they're on the committee, where they have volunteered to do the work. So the challenges are maybe less than in a paid job, where people are maybe trying to avoid responsibility when they're meant to be paid for responsibility. When people volunteer, they tend to be more willing to do it because it's their choice.
And what do you think is the significance of the student interviewers in the committee? How do they play different roles from the faculty interviewers?
The way it's set up is the students' representative goes first. So there's a tendency there that there are a couple of slightly simpler questions, but that also allows us to understand whether the lecturers are aware of slightly different versions of English. Although the student representatives are usually English majors and their English is very good, there is that point of listening, which often is there as well when I begin asking questions. Do they understand me? And bear in mind I don't have a sort of standard American accent or standard British English accent. If they're not really understanding the student or me, then that's quite a good indicator of their ability to teach. Because they have to be aware of patience and listening, and how they respond when they haven't quite understood the question is a nice indicator of that, and that's good when the student representative is phrasing things and there's that slight difference in the accent. And that's sort of one of that's the first role, is like setting up the interview and making the candidate aware that we're also involving students in the process, which is a unique step. Quite often people refer to it as unique, they've never seen a student representative, but ultimately teachers are going to be teaching students. So it's good that they're getting an input on that, and that's sort of where the result is, because when we're deciding on each candidate, the student feedback is as equally important as the lecturer's feedback, and also there's some point of discussion. So for the students as well, they get to learn the idea of norming across thought. So it's not just about liking someone, it's how they've talked about the subject. And once the student representative get used to the language they should be hearing, then they become much more aware of maybe the difference between everyday language and sort of academic language. That it's not about charisma, but it's about intellectual input, which is a secondary useful thing for the student to learn.
Thank you. And my question number 4 is, will the scale of the committee expand in the future, and would you like to increase the number of student interviewers?
When I first started on the committee, there were only 2 members. There was the chair and myself as an assistant. Then it got expanded. I'm not sure if it got expanded to include a student before it got expanded to also include additional members. So currently the team is at 5, although we only have had 4 as a team, plus 2 student representatives. And bearing in mind the amount of interviews that we have to do, there has been talk of increasing the faculty team and increasing the members of student representatives. That also makes sense, but there's a slight problem in that, in the fact that depends how often we're interviewing, because it depends on the jobs that we have. So sometimes we could only be hiring for 1 or 2 candidates, but sometimes we're hiring for 5 or 6. It depends on the year. So then it depends on, there are less interviews if you're hiring for less jobs, because there's not the same need. So that becomes an ongoing question of how many people are actually required for the committee. But 2 representatives and 4 committee members plus myself has worked over the last couple of years.
Okay, and my last question is, how do you think students can contribute to the committee more meaningfully? For instance, will encourage students to ask questions from their own perspectives about stuff they do care about.
Well, one of the problems is in that situation is that we are meant to standardize the questions. So every candidate should be getting the same 6 questions, although there is an adjustment, 1 additional question in our general set of questions that is about for Chinese teachers who may be using Chinese as a means of communication. But inside that's one of the questions. There is obviously students are welcome to give feedback on the questions and the way that they ask the questions. That's always something that's required, and midway through this semester there was an adjustment to the question, because we're really hiring usually for 2 different jobs, and I took it upon myself to adjust the questions slightly to gear it more towards the composition side rather than the ESL side, and these are ongoing discussions, but we were asked to standardise the questions by the I'm actually not sure what his role is, but the head of academic affairs, who is from America, he said that the interview should be standardised. So the question of what input is there needs to be also considered within the frame of the interview, and there should be some sort of standardisation. Not that we're saying that all the questions have to be read in exactly the same, but slight adjustments to the questions while people are speaking. It maintains a naturalness to the interview. But at the end, like as we're now at sort of the end of the process, there will be a sort of feedback loop between lecturers and students to get a feel for whether or not the questions need adjusted and what should be done going forward in the future. Of course, within the interviews, if there's a need, if a question isn't quite answered correctly, then it's okay to push for an answer, to make them answer the question. Although they should be answering questions, but sometimes people who nerves get sidetracked or the questions seem a little bit long and they only answer part of it and they're missing something. And that's also part of the interview process. And students are allowed to do that. And then there's the contribution at the end is always really important, telling us what score you give the candidate, and some questions around that, which is also the nature of our scoring method, because the scoring method existed for our old system, and there might be a way to rephrase our scoring, because there are always problems with systems, and we also want to change them and adapt them for the future to make them more equipped. Yeah, but it seems to work okay as it is. But there's always a scope for better. Yes.
Thank you for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you. That was fun.
Okay.
Enjoy. Thank you for helping with the committee.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.